When building apps, especially web apps, you have a number of configurable points and data such as database access credentials and URIs, social authentication access credentials, and many other key values that are required by your app to either access APIs, services, and many other variable entities. It is therefore necessary to design environments within which we would want our app to work. For a Node.js app, for instance, we can have two environments, namely development and production. Development would be an environment where temporary and local access credentials are loaded into your app. Since the app, while in development, is probably running on your own machine or at a workplace, its resources are temporary and ad hoc at best. But once the app is ready to be deployed and moved out into the real world, it has to be hooked to production-grade resources. As an example, when building an app locally, you might want to use a local copy of MongoDB on your machine. But when you're ready to deploy, you would need to switch over to something like MongoLab. In this case, across these two environments, your database access URIs and access credentials would change. Now, if you were to hardcode these into your app, every time you would want to switch environments, you would need to go in and change all these variables, which is obviously a bad idea. So we need a way to conveniently switch configurations and efficiently manage these environment-specific entities in one place. And that is what we'll do in this screencast. We will build a mechanism where URIs, access credentials, etc. are automatically loaded in based on the environment in use. So while in development, all access credentials, database URIs, etc. would be loaded in from a JSON file on disk called development.json. This is convenient because I can easily add key value pairs to this file and we can just load it straight into our app and use the variables wherever needed. This would not be the case, however, when we deploy our app in a production environment. Though you can drop all production credentials into a JSON file, it would not be the safest place to store critical data, and for obvious reasons. If someone were to hack into your server instance, they would easily be able to get this data from the JSON file. So a better and safer strategy here is to store production level configuration data into the host's environment variables. Environment variables can be created in a number of ways, and they are not readily accessible, such as in the case of a JSON file on disk. They are either stored in .dot files, which are not listed by the system, so they are virtually invisible to someone browsing files on the server, or they are stored in the kernel mapped to every process. Either way, it is harder to gain ready access to environment variables. When deploying on Heroku, we get an easy and convenient way to map environment variables for our app, and this is where we would be storing our production grade configuration data. Having said that, we need a way for our app to automatically switch our configuration data set based on the environment. For this purpose, we will access an environment variable called node_env. Locally, when you are developing the app, this may not be present, in which case we will assume that we are running in a development environment. On Heroku, this environment variable is set to a string value called production, and this is our cue to read all configuration data from Heroku's environment variables. So if the value of process.env.node_env is production, then we would want to load configuration data from Heroku's environment variables, or else we would assume we are in development and hence we would want to load our data from a file called development.json. Alright, so back in our app, let's begin by creating a folder called config within our app folder like so. Inside this folder, I'll first create my development.json file. Inside this file, create an object, and I'll create my first key here called host, which we'll set to our localhost URI like so. This will be used later, but let's just drop this in here for now. The next key here would be called dbURI, and this is where we would want to store the URI to our MongoDB database instance that we created in the screencast. Now, you do have a choice to point to a local copy of MongoDB here, but I'm just going to use my MongoLab instance right away. So head back to your MongoLab dashboard and copy this URI into your development.json file like so. Once done, edit this URI to include the username and password for the user you created for your database instance. Do remember that this is not the username and password that you would use to log into your MongoLab account. These are credentials for the user you created for this database instance. Also important to note here is that this URI ends with the name of your database instance and should not include a trailing slash, or else you won't be able to access the database at all. Now, once you have the development.json in place, the next thing we need is a configuration loader module, which will bring in the right set of configuration data based on the execution environment. So within the config folder, create an index.js file. And we'll start with a simple if statement that checks to see if the value of process.env.node_env is equal to the value production or not. And if so, it should offer production stage environment variables, or else we'll simply use module.exports to export the contents of the development.json file. The require statement here readily brings in the JSON file for use without having the need to manually parse the file. Now, for production stage, we'll use module.exports to export an object straight away, where we'll set the host key to process.env.host, or if that is not available, then a blank string. Notice how process.env gives direct access to environment variables on the system, and this is exactly how we accessed the node_env variable as well. This would also involve setting these variables on the host system, such as on Heroku when we deploy the app. Similarly, we'll also create a variable called dbURI, and we'll set it to process.env.dbURI. Do ensure that these keys are spelled exactly in the same way as you have in the development.json file. We'll keep adding more entities to this system as we go along. So this is how you can get your app to automatically load in the right set of configuration variables depending on the execution environment that your app is operating under at a given time.